What is that smoke?
I don't know. It's coming from the back.
We need to get out of here.
Go.
The hull's breached! We're losing pressure!
I know, reroute power stabilizers!
On it! Hold on!
Brace, another wave!
When your hijacked private jet is plunging toward the Atlantic Ocean at 600 miles an hour, you don't pray, and you don't brace for impact. You grab a scalpel, and you prepare for war. Hello, family. Welcome back to Afro K Mafia Diary. Before we proceed to the story, I would love to know where you are watching from. Kindly drop it in the comments section and also subscribe to this channel. Now, let's continue with the story. The cabin of the Gulfstream was a chaotic strobe of emergency red lights. The air pressure was violently venting out, sucking the oxygen directly from their lungs. Jun-ho's older brother, the man supposed to be rotting in a soul cemetery, was laughing through the intercom. He had rigged the autopilot to dive straight into the ocean, turning the luxury jet into a 40-ton missile. Amara didn't panic. But her surgeon's brain, trained for catastrophic trauma, completely took over. She grabbed the drop-down oxygen masks, slamming one onto Jun-ho's face before securing her own. He was bleeding heavily from his previous shotgun wound, his face pale, but his dark eyes were burning with a terrifying homicidal clarity. "The cockpit door is reinforced titanium," Jun-ho rasped through the plastic mask, gripping his pistol. "Bullets won't scratch it." Amara's eyes darted around the luxurious, tilting cabin. She wasn't looking for a parachute. They were over open water in a violent storm. She was looking for an artery to cut. Her gaze locked onto the main avionics access panel, bolted to the floor near the cockpit bulkhead. "I don't need a gun!" Amara yelled over the screaming engines, pulling her titanium scalpel from her tactical vest. "I just need to sever the brain." She threw herself across the steeply angled floor, fighting G-force and zero visibility. She wedged the scalpel under the heavy access panel, prying it up to expose the jet's central wiring cortex. "Which one controls the autopilot override?" she screamed. Jun-ho braced his boots against the wall, his eyes tracking the color-coded schematics he had memorized when he bought the plane. "The yellow and black feed." Amara gripped the thick bundle of wires. If she cut the wrong one, the fuel tanks would detonate mid-air. She didn't hesitate. She slashed through the thick cable just as the black ocean rushed up to meet the windshield. Surviving a catastrophic plane crash in the middle of the Atlantic is a medical anomaly. Surviving the freezing water while dragging a bleeding mafia boss to shore requires something far more dangerous than medicine. It requires pure, unfiltered obsession. The Gulfstream hit the Atlantic like a concrete wall. Severing the autopilot gave Amara exactly 3 seconds to pull the nose up, turning a fatal dive into a brutal water landing. The impact shattered the windshield, flooding the cabin with freezing, pitch-black water. Amara unbuckled instantly. She didn't look for the life raft. She dove into the rising tide, grabbing the collar of Jun-ho's trench coat. He was semi-conscious, the G-force and his previous shotgun wound finally breaking his unnatural endurance. She kicked off the sinking fuselage, dragging his heavy weight through the emergency hatch and into the violent ocean just as the jet slipped into the abyss. It took 2 hours of agonizing hypothermic swimming to reach a desolate stretch of rocky coastline. Amara dragged Jun-ho onto the freezing sand, her muscles screaming in total failure. She collapsed beside him, her frozen fingers immediately finding his carotid artery. His pulse was a terrifyingly weak flutter. The salt water had violently flushed his gunshot wound, but the blood loss was critical. Jun-ho slowly opened his dark eyes, staring up at the storm-broken sky. He didn't look at his ruined body. He looked at the woman who had just defied death for him a second time. "He thinks we're at the bottom of the ocean," Jun-ho whispered, his voice a barely audible rasp over the crashing waves. A dark, terrifying smile cracked his pale lips. Amara stared down at him, her tactical mind instantly seeing the advantage. The brother hadn't just tried to execute them, he had accidentally given them the ultimate cover. To the soul underworld, the king and the doctor were officially dead. "Let him think it," Amara replied, her voice turning to ice. "We aren't going back as targets, Jun-ho. We are going back as ghosts. When you kill the king of the soul underworld, you don't just take his throne, you throw a party on his grave. But the new chairman is about to learn a terrifying medical fact. Sometimes the dead refuse to stay buried. 6 weeks after the Gulf Stream vanished into the Atlantic, the Dragon's Den penthouse was unrecognizable. Jun-ho's older brother, Dae-sung, had ripped out his siblings' medical equipment and replaced it with gold and absolute arrogance. He ruled the empire with unchecked paranoia, violently purging anyone loyal to his brother's ghost. But absolute power comes with severe, crippling ulcers. Dae-sung demanded the absolute best private care dirty money could buy, completely unaware that his newly hired elite concierge physician was the exact same woman he had tried to drown in the ocean. Dr. Amara Okoro walked into the penthouse wearing a pristine, tailored white suit, her signature complex braids hidden beneath a sleek, blunt-cut silk wig. Her forged international medical license read, Dr. Evelyn Thorne. She didn't flinch when Dae-sung's heavily armed enforcers patted down her designer medical bag. She didn't break eye contact when the man who had hijacked her jet offered his arm for a blood pressure cuff. Amara wrapped the nylon band around his bicep, her fingers pressing directly into his pulse point. Her touch was perfectly clinical, masking the absolute homicidal venom pumping through her own veins. "Your pressure is dangerously elevated, Chairman Kang," Amara murmured, her voice a soothing, unrecognizable alto. Dae-sung smirked, leaning back in Jun-ho's stolen leather chair. "Heavy lies the crown, Doctor." Amara detached the cuff, a cold, predatory smile hiding perfectly behind her professional facade. She wasn't there to cure his stress. She was there to be the architect of his demise, planting the very first drop of a slow-acting nightmare that would burn his stolen empire to the ground. The Trojan horse was officially inside the gates. To conquer a mafia empire, you don't need a standing army. You just need a medical degree, full access to their veins, and a willingness to break every oath you ever took. But Dae-sung's lieutenants lived in a state of hyper-violent luxury, fueled by adrenaline, expensive liquor, and absolute paranoia. When the chairman's elite new concierge doctor offered exclusive, high-end vitamin IV therapies to keep his top enforcers sharp, they didn't ask questions. They simply rolled up their sleeves. Amara stood in the opulent private lounge of the Dragon's Den, expertly tapping a sterile syringe. She wasn't injecting them with hydration. She was microdosing the violent heart of the soul underworld with a synthesized, untraceable neurotoxin. It was a poetic, brutal symmetry. What Dae-sung had violently done to Jun-ho's spine, Amara was now chemically replicating across his entire army. The neurotoxin didn't kill. It degraded motor functions. It turned a quick draw into a fatal fumble. It made a sniper's hand tremble uncontrollably. Amara moved through the room of heavily armed men, adjusting their IV drips with a soothing bedside manner and a heart made of absolute ice. She was surgically dismantling the chairman's shield, leaving him completely exposed without a single gunshot echoing in the penthouse. The first crack in the armor appeared 72 hours later. Dae-sung's lead enforcer, one of the mercenaries who had personally hunted Amara in South Africa, stood guarding the penthouse elevator. As he reached to unclip his radio, his fingers violently spasmed. The heavy device slipped from his numb grip, shattering against the marble floor. He stared at his trembling hand in sheer, unadulterated terror, his nervous system quietly collapsing. Amara watched from the shadows of the hallway, a cold, predatory smile touching her lips. The wolves were crippled. It was time for the Black Dragon to return. There is only one thing more terrifying than realizing your nervous system is shutting down. It's realizing that the paralysis isn't an accident. It's a countdown. And the monster waiting at 0 is a ghost you thought you buried at the bottom of the Atlantic. The back alleys of Seoul's elite gangland were usually loud with the arrogant swagger of Chairman Dae-sung's enforcers. Tonight they were a slaughterhouse. Amara's untraceable neurotoxin had perfectly degraded their motor functions. They were sluggish, their hands trembling, their reflexes violently misfiring. They were no longer apex predators. They were tethered goats bleeding in the dark. The chairman's lead enforcer stumbled out of a VIP club, desperately trying to grip his weapon. His fingers wouldn't obey. He dropped the heavy pistol, the metal clattering uselessly against the wet pavement. The temperature in the alley plummeted. From the absolute pitch-black shadows, a tall, tailored figure stepped into the flickering neon light. No wheelchair, no limp, no mercy. Kang Jun-ho, the Black Dragon, had returned to his city. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't need to. He walked toward the violently shaking enforcer with the slow, terrifying grace of a king reclaiming his execution block. The enforcer tried to scream, to warn the chairman, but his vocal cords seized, paralyzed by the doctor who owned Jun-ho's soul. Jun-ho stopped inches from the terrified man. He reached out, his bare, steady hand effortlessly snapping the enforcer's neck with a sickening, definitive crack. He let the body drop into the neon-lit puddles. He didn't hide the corpse. He left a solid black titanium coin resting on the dead man's chest, a beautifully cruel insignia of a coiled dragon. The phantom was awake, the hunt was synchronized, and the chairman's empire was about to bleed. When the bodies of your elite enforcers start piling up in the alleys with their necks snapped, you don't call the police. You lock the city down, because a chairman without his shield is just a dead man waiting for the blade. The Dragon's Den penthouse was no longer a palace of arrogance. It was a pressurized tomb of panic. Chairman Dae-sung stared at the solid black titanium coin resting on his mahogany desk. The coiled dragon insignia mocked him. He had paid millions to ensure his little brother went down with that Gulf Stream. Yet here was the absolute proof that the Black Dragon was awake, walking the streets of Seoul and systematically slaughtering his men. Dae-sung screamed, sweeping the remaining crystal glasses off his desk. He slammed his fist into the emergency lockdown button, sealing the penthouse behind 4 inches of reinforced steel. "No one gets in! No one leaves!" Dae-sung roared at his surviving guards. He didn't realize the fatal flaw in his siege mentality. He was locking the doors to keep the monster out, completely oblivious to the fact that the architect of his destruction was already locked inside with him. Dr. Amara Okoro stood quietly in the corner of the room, holding a pristine silver medical tray. Her pulse was perfectly steady. She watched the chairman mentally unravel, her dark eyes entirely devoid of mercy. Dae-sung collapsed into his leather chair, clutching his chest as a brutal panic attack seized his heart. "Dr. Thorne," he gasped, his arrogant facade completely shattered. I need a sedative." Amara stepped forward, her tailored white suit a stark contrast to the violent chaos of the room. She calmly prepared a syringe, her clinical mask flawless. "Of course, Chairman," she murmured, her voice a deadly, soothing whisper. "Just relax. The worst is already inside." In the Mafia, paranoia is a survival trait. When the chairman finally realizes the predator isn't outside the gates, but already inside his bedroom, he doesn't call a meeting. He calls an interrogation. Dae-sung leveled a gold-plated revolver at Amara's forehead. On the floor lay his head of security, a man Amara had chemically crippled. Dae-sung didn't believe in coincidences. "Every man who touches your IV drips ends up in the morgue, Dr. Thorne," he rasped, clicking the hammer back. Amara didn't flinch. She stood over her medical tray, wiping a scalpel. Her medical training was her armor. "If you pull that trigger, you will die of a coronary event in 6 hours, she stated, her voice flat. "Though the vitamins I gave you are stabilizing your blood pressure against the poison your own men have been feeding you." It was a masterclass in gaslighting. Dae-sung's eyes widened, the gun wavering. He was so desperate to find the mole that he fell for the lie. He lowered the weapon, his breathing terrified. "My men? Which ones?" Amara stepped into his space, her eyes locking onto his. "All of them," she whispered, her fingers trailing over his carotid artery. "The only person you can trust is the one holding the cure. You can build a fortress out of titanium and bulletproof glass, but in the modern underworld, your walls are only as strong as your firewall. and the black dragon just found the back door. Inside the locked-down dragon's den, the air grew stale. Chairman Dae-sung paced the floor, all clutching the cure Amara had given him, completely unaware he was holding a placebo. Suddenly, every screen in the penthouse flickered to life. The security feeds didn't show the hallways. They showed a single image, a digital rendering of a heartbeat monitor slowing down. Then, the lights cut out. The backup generators groaned and died. Jun-ho hadn't just breached the building, he had hijacked the entire electrical grid of the district. The hunter was turning the chairman's high-tech sanctuary into a sensory deprivation tank. "Doctor! Where are you?" Dae-sung screamed into the pitch blackness. He scrambled for his gold-plated revolver, but his fingers, still affected by Amara's subtle chemical manipulation, were clumsy and slow. In the corner of the room, a tablet glowed to life. A voice echoed from the speakers. Not the distorted voice of a hacker, but the calm, lethal baritone of the brother he thought he'd drowned. "The air in that room will last precisely 30 minutes, Dae-sung. I hope you find the darkness comforting. I lived in it for 6 months because of you." Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced the chairman's ego. He realized the lockdown wasn't keeping Jun-ho out. It was holding him in for the slaughter. He turned toward the medical suite, hoping for Dr. Thorne's guidance, but the room was empty. The doctor was gone, and in her place sat a single solid black titanium coin on the surgical tray. The ghost was in the grid, the oxygen was fading, and the real execution was about to begin. When you're trapped in a hospital basement with a squad of professional assassins, you don't reach for a white flag. You reach for the tools of your trade. Because in the hands of a surgeon, a morgue isn't a place of rest. It's a weapons locker. The penthouse was dark, but the battle for the lower levels was screaming with light. Amara had slipped through the service elevator, heading for the building's medical storage, only to be cut off by Dae-sung's final 3 loyalists, unaffected mercenaries who had avoided her IV drips. They cornered her in the morgue, their tactical flashlights slicing through the cold, sterile air. They didn't want to talk. They had orders to erase the concierge doctor who had compromised their chairman. Amara dove behind a stainless steel autopsy table just as a suppressed round sparked off the metal. She didn't have a gun, but she was surrounded by the sharpest blades in Seoul. As the first mercenary rounded the corner, Amara didn't retreat. She lunged, driving a heavy-duty orthopedic trocar into his thigh with a surgeon's knowledge of the femoral artery. He collapsed, clutching his leg in a fountain of crimson. She didn't stop. She grabbed a pair of charged defibrillator paddles from the wall. When the second man lunged, she slammed the pads against his neck and triggered the maximum voltage. He hit the floor in a violent, seizing heap, his heart rhythm shattered by 360 joules of justice. The final enforcer hesitated, his flashlight beam trembling. In that second of doubt, the heavy steel morgue door was kicked off its hinges. Jun-ho stepped through the smoke, his silhouette tall and terrifying. He didn't even look at the mercenary. His eyes were locked on Amara, who stood over the fallen men, on her white coat stained with the blood of her enemies. Jun-ho raised his pistol and fired a single perfect shot. The mercenary fell. The path to the final floor was clear. The king and his surgeon were reunited, and the chairman's time had officially run out. When you spend your life breaking people and putting them back together, you learn exactly where the structural weaknesses are, not just in the human body, but in a fortress. Today, Dr. Amara Okoro isn't here to heal. She's here to breach. The steel doors of the penthouse didn't just open, they disintegrated. Jun-ho and Amara stepped through the smoke, moving with a terrifying, unspoken synchronization that 6 months of trauma had forged into steel. Jun-ho held a tactical carbine, his movements fluid and predatory, a living rebuke to the brother who had tried to paralyze him. Beside him, Amara moved like a phantom in her blood-stained white coat, a suppressed pistol in one hand and a chemical grenade in the other. They weren't just an assault team, they were the inevitable consequence of Dae-sung's arrogance. The penthouse was a graveyard of broken glass and expensive art. The final circle of guards, blinded by the flashbang and choked by the paralyzing gas Amara had released into the vents, fell before they could even level their weapons. Jun-ho didn't waste a single bullet. He moved through the room with surgical precision, clearing the path for the woman who had saved his life twice. They reached the center of the room where Dae-sung stood, his gold-plated revolver trembling in his hand, his face a mask of sweating, unadulterated terror. He looked at the brother he thought he'd killed, or then at the doctor he thought he'd hired. "It's over, Dae-sung." Jun-ho's voice was a low, vibrating baritone that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. He lowered his weapon, not out of mercy, but out of total dominance. Amara stepped forward, the red laser from her pistol centering perfectly on the chairman's forehead. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't angry. She was just a surgeon preparing for the final incision. Dae-sung looked into her eyes and realized he wasn't looking at a doctor. He was looking at his executioner. You can share the same blood, the same name, and the same empire, but you can never share the same throne. In the House of the Black Dragon, the only thing thicker than water is the blood you spill to stay on top. The silence in the ruined penthouse was more suffocating than the smoke. Dae-sung stood behind his mahogany desk, the gold-plated revolver trembling in his grip. He looked at Jun-ho, the brother he had broken, the brother he had tried to bury at the bottom of the sea. Jun-ho didn't even have his weapon raised. He just stood there, a tall, silent phantom of the man he used to be, now stronger and colder. Amara remained at his side, her laser sight a steady red dot on Dae-sung's heart. She wasn't just a witness, she was the jury. "You think you can just take it back?" Dae-sung's voice was high, cracked with the onset of total mental collapse. "The board, the money, the men, they belong to me now." He laughed, a jagged, pathetic sound. "I am the one who stood up when you were crawling in the dirt." Jun-ho took a step forward, his polished shoes crunching on the glass of his own stolen legacy. But he didn't look angry. He looked disappointed. "You didn't stand up, Dae-sung." Jun-ho's baritone was a death knell. "You sat in my chair and waited for the world to notice you weren't me. They noticed." Dae-sung's finger tightened on the trigger. In that split second of ultimate betrayal, Jun-ho didn't flinch. He knew his brother's nerves were shredded by Amara's chemical warfare. The gold gun fired, a deafening roar, but the bullet went wide, shattering a portrait behind Jun-ho's head. Before Dae-sung could fire again, Amara didn't pull her trigger. She threw a heavy medical case onto the desk. It popped open to reveal the digital ledger, the real one. "The money is gone, Dae-sung," she whispered. "I didn't just help him return, I helped him erase you." In the operating room, the surgeon is God. They decide who wakes up and who sleeps forever. But when the patient is the man who tried to murder you, the choice isn't just about medicine. It's about the exact weight of your revenge. Chairman Dae-sung collapsed against his mahogany desk, his hand clawing at his throat. The cure Amara had been injecting for weeks, the one he thought was saving him, was finally revealing its true purpose. Amara stepped closer, the light reflecting off her surgical shears. She didn't look like a doctor anymore. She looked like a reaper in a white coat. She checked the monitor on her wrist, her face a mask of cold, mathematical precision. "The neurotoxin I gave you was never meant to kill you, Dae-sung," she whispered, her voice cutting through his panic. "It was meant to lock you in." Dae-sung tried to speak, but his jaw was a frozen block of stone. His eyes darted to Jun-ho, pleading for a brother's mercy, but he found only the cold steel of the Black Dragon's gaze. Amara leaned in, her breath hot against Dae-sung's ear. "It's called locked-in syndrome. You will be fully awake. You will hear every word. You will feel every touch, but you will never move a single muscle for the rest of your life." She held up the final syringe, the catalyst. "This is the surgeon's choice. I can let the toxin finish its work, or I can give you the antidote, but the price of the antidote is the one thing you can't pay." She turned to Jun-ho, the silent question hanging in the air. The power in the room shifted entirely to her. She wasn't just Junho's surgeon, she was the architect of their future. Junho walked to her side, his hand resting possessively on her shoulder. He didn't look at his brother. He looked at the woman who had dismantled an empire to save him. "The choice is yours, Amara," Junho rasped, his voice thick with a dark, lethal respect. "I am just the hand that executes your will." A city doesn't change hands in a boardroom, it changes in the gutters. When the Black Dragon breathes fire, every rat in the underworld has to make a choice: crawl back into the shadows or burn with the trash. The penthouse was a tomb, but the city was a powder keg. Daesung's remaining captains, scattered across Seoul's neon-soaked districts, were already moving to seize the fragments of the crumbling empire. They didn't know their chairman was now a prisoner in his own skin. They only knew the throne appeared vacant. Junho stood on the edge of the penthouse balcony, looking down at the sprawling metropolis. He didn't need a rifle. He had something far more destructive: the truth. "They need to see the signal, Amara," Junho said, his voice a low, commanding rumble. Amara stood beside him, her tablet glowing with the real-time coordinates of every major mafia hub and money-laundering front in the city. She had spent her weeks as Dr. Thorne doing more than just poisoning the chairman. She had mapped his entire logistics network. With a single decisive swipe on her screen, she hijacked the city's digital infrastructure. Every billboard in Gangnam wiped black, replaced by a single pulsing red dragon and a live feed of the paralyzed chairman. The streets erupted in a coordinated surgical strike. In the dark alleys and high-rise offices, the old guard, men who had been purged or forced into hiding, stepped out of the shadows. They didn't need a speech. The image of their fallen usurper was enough. Loyalists armed with suppressed weapons and Amara's chemical paralyzers descended on the dissenters. The street war wasn't a brawl, it was an execution. By the time the sun broke over the Han River, the Dragon Empire was no longer a divided house. It was a unified weapon, and the doctor was the one holding the trigger. Every crime leaves a scar, but in the digital age those scars are made of data. For Amara Okoro, erasing a mafia empire's paper trail isn't a hack, it's an amputation. You don't hide the evidence, you surgically remove the memory. In the high-tech hub of the Dragon's Den, Amara sat bathed in the blue glow of 6 monitors. She was systematically scrubbing the record of every offshore transaction, every bribe, and every digital footprint of Dr. Evelyn Thorne. Beside her, Junho stood guard, his eyes tracking the perimeter sensors. Outside, the world was waking up to a new reality, and the international authorities were already mobilizing. Their digital signatures were closing in like a viral infection. "I need 5 minutes to finalize the transfer," Amara whispered, her fingers flying across the keys. Junho checked his weapon, his voice a low promise. "I'll give you 10. She didn't just delete the files. She rerouted the brothers' stolen billions through a labyrinth of shell companies in the Western Cape. She was burying the evidence so deep that even a forensic audit couldn't find the receipt. Suddenly, a red alert flashed on the main screen. A hidden failsafe, buried in the ledger by the brother, had been triggered. If a biometric key wasn't provided in 60 seconds, the entire network would self-destruct, incinerating the funds and their identities with it. Amara didn't panic. She grabbed Junho's hand, pressing his thumb against the encrypted scanner just as the timer hit 0. The vault clicked open. The funds vanished into the ghost accounts, and the digital slate wiped clean. The empire was financially secure, and their identities were officially erased from the grid. As the distant wail of sirens began to echo through the streets of Seoul, Amara looked at Junho. The war was over, the money was theirs, and now they just had to decide how to vanish. A suture is more than just a stitch. It is the final act of healing. It is the moment you decide the wound has stayed open long enough, and the only thing left to do is pull the thread tight and walk away from the scar. The penthouse of the Dragon's Den was silent, save for the wind whistling through the shattered windows. Below, the blue and red lights of the Seoul police flooded the streets, but they were chasing shadows. The king and his surgeon were already on the roof. Jun-ho stood by the helipad, his dark trench coat whipping in the wind. He looked down at his city one last time, not as a man obsessed with a stolen throne, but as a man who had finally found something worth more than power. Amara joined him, her hair catching the moonlight. She wasn't carrying a medical bag anymore, she was carrying the future. In the room below, Dae-sung remained in his golden chair, fully conscious, eternally still, a prisoner of his own skin, the ultimate justice for a man who tried to play God. "The flight plan is set," Amara said, her voice a calm, steady anchor. Jun-ho turned to her, his dark eyes softening with a lethal, absolute devotion. He took her hand, his grip firm and steady, the hand of a man who could walk only because she refused to let him fall. "Where to, doctor?" he asked, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. Amara looked toward the horizon, where the sun was beginning to break over the Han River. She didn't need a clinic or a hospital anymore. She was the architect of a new world, and he was the dragon who guarded it. "Somewhere they can't find us," she replied, stepping into the helicopter. "Somewhere we can finally start the next chapter." As the blades roared to life and they rose into the dawn, the Afro-K Mafia dragon didn't just end, it became a legend. The Afro-K Mafia dragon proved one absolute truth. A throne is never just inherited, it is earned in the dark, paid for in blood, and secured by the person standing at your back. Kang Jun-ho and Amara Okoro didn't just survive the underworld, they rewrote its entire anatomy. Never let anyone tell you that your lowest moment is your final chapter. They may strip you of your title, your money, or your legs, but they can never take your mind. When the world tries to bury you, don't just dig yourself out. Rebuild the mountain, claim the high ground, and become the architect of your own empire. You are the surgeon of your own destiny. Cut out the toxic, stitch up your wounds, and rise. If the finale of this epic Afro-K Mafia dragon had your heart pounding, I'd smash that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story. Drop a comment below and let me know. Did Dae-sung get exactly the justice he deserved with locked-in syndrome, or should Amara and Jun-ho have ended it differently? Share this video with someone who loves a high-stakes story where the underdog takes the ultimate crown. Thanks for watching.